The story of the Khmer Rouge is a story of how radical ideology, combined with fear and absolute power, brought a nation to the edge of extinction. Cambodia, a country with deep cultural roots and centuries of history, would face one of the deadliest social experiments of the 20th century. Over the course of less than 4 years, from 1975 to 1979, more than 1.7 million people would lose their lives to execution, starvation, disease, and forced labor. The regime responsible called itself Democratic Kampuchea, but its enemies and survivors came to know it by another name, the Khmer Rouge. The origins of the Khmer Rouge trace back long before their dramatic rise to power. Cambodia in the mid-20th century remained largely rural, shaped by agriculture and an ancient Buddhist heritage. Under French colonial rule, the country experienced slow modernization, yet inequality persisted. A small elite benefited from connections with the monarchy and foreign influence, while the majority of the population struggled in poverty. After World War II, anti-colonial movements surged across Southeast Asia. In Cambodia, a new generation of students became fascinated with revolutionary philosophy, especially communism. One among them would later come to dominate the fate of the nation. His name was Saloth Sar, later known to the world as Pol Pot. During the 1950s, Saloth Sar studied in Paris, where he joined the French Communist Party. He became convinced that society could be remade by destroying old systems completely. The ideas he absorbed abroad transformed into a uniquely radical vision, one that would later reject even the Soviet and Chinese models for being too moderate. When he returned to Cambodia, he joined underground communist networks as the political landscape of the country shifted. Cambodia gained independence in 1953 under King Norodom Sihanouk, and although the monarchy maintained power, the seeds of radicalism had already been planted. Throughout the 1960s, political tensions intensified. Cambodia was caught between external forces during the Vietnam War. While Sihanouk attempted to maintain neutrality, North Vietnamese forces used Cambodian territory to move supplies, and the United States launched secret bombing campaigns to destroy these routes. The countryside suffered explosive violence. Villagers who once lived quietly suddenly faced devastation from the sky. Their anger and fear created fertile ground for insurgent recruiters. Among the insurgents were the Khmer Rouge. They promised a future free from corruption, foreign domination, and inequality. Their leaders withdrew to remote jungle zones, where they built a disciplined revolutionary force. While the movement grew, the capital city Phnom Penh drifted into political chaos. In 1970, a coup led by General Lon Nol removed Sihanouk from power and aligned Cambodia with the United States. The civil war that followed only deepened suffering. By the mid-1970s, years of bombardment, hunger, and instability pushed many rural Cambodians to embrace the rebels. The Khmer Rouge claimed to fight for justice and equality. They spoke of ending class divisions and freeing the country from imperialist influence. But within their ranks, a much harsher agenda was taking shape. The leadership believed that true independence could only be achieved by tearing down everything they saw as corrupt: cities, education, religion, markets, and even family bonds. To them, survival of the nation required purifying it of anything considered foreign, modern, or bourgeois. By 1975, Lon Nol's government had become weak and isolated. Massive inflation and shortages plagued Phnom Penh. War refugees flooded into the city from the countryside, swelling the population to over 2 million people. Food was scarce, law and order were evaporating, hospitals were overwhelmed. For many, the arrival of the Khmer Rouge on April 17, 1975, felt like an end to war, a moment of relief. Civilians came into the streets to greet the soldiers, offering them flowers and cheers. They expected peace, but peace did not come. Within hours of capturing Phnom Penh, the Khmer Rouge issued a command that shocked the world. The entire population of the capital was to be evacuated immediately. Loudspeakers blared orders telling people that the Americans were planning to bomb the city and that they must leave for only a few days. The claim was false. Armed soldiers marched through the streets, forcing hospital patients from their beds, ordering families to gather what they could carry and walk into the countryside. Many pushed wheelbarrows with dying relatives. Many more would collapse on the journey. For the Khmer Rouge leadership, this was not an evacuation. It was the beginning of a new society. They believed cities were nests of corruption, home to capitalism and selfishness. They planned to transform Cambodia into a completely agrarian communist state where everyone worked collectively and no one owned personal property. Phnom Penh was to become a ghost city, a symbol of the old world erased. As the people marched, they passed signs of the new rule. Soldiers wore black uniforms without insignia. They demanded obedience without explanation. They asked citizens about their background. Anyone who admitted to being a soldier, a government worker, a student, or connected to foreigners risked immediate execution. The message was clear. The old society no longer existed. Identity itself became dangerous. The forced evacuation of cities occurred across the country. Battambang, Kampong Cham, and other urban centers were emptied. Cambodia's urban population was scattered into rural cooperatives where life would be restructured from the ground up. The Khmer Rouge renamed the country Democratic Kampuchea. They declared that Year Zero had begun. All history before the revolution was considered worthless. The clock of civilization was reset. Pol Pot and the leadership corps, known as the Angkar or the organization, designed the new system. They envisioned a pure agrarian utopia based on collective farming and self-sufficiency. Private ownership was abolished, money disappeared overnight, markets shut down, schools closed, religion became illegal. Monks were forced to abandon their robes and labor like everyone else. Temples and libraries were converted, repurposed, or destroyed. The Angkar expected rice production to skyrocket, even though they refused to allow traditional farming methods or tools. They demanded unrealistic quotas, forcing people to work from before sunrise until nightfall. Workers barely received enough food to survive. The sick received no relief. Hard labor became the measure of loyalty. Weakness became a crime. The regime divided the population into categories. Those with revolutionary roots, mostly rural peasants, were considered base people. They were viewed as trustworthy. Urban workers, educated individuals, and anyone associated with the previous government were labeled new people. New people were monitored closely, denied rights, and subjected to the harshest conditions. They were expected to prove their loyalty through suffering. Daily life became defined by fear. The Angkar controlled all communication, information, and movement. Villagers lived under constant surveillance by local cadres. Even accidental mistakes could be interpreted as sabotage. Anyone accused of resisting, complaining, or showing individuality faced arrest. The belief that the slightest sign of disobedience threatened the entire revolution turned paranoia into policy. The Khmer Rouge leadership saw enemies everywhere. They feared spies, traitors, and ideological contamination. The solution to doubt was violence. Interrogation centers, most notoriously S-21 in Phnom Penh, operated as factories of confession. Prisoners were forced to admit to crimes they had not committed, accused of being agents of Vietnam, America, or the CIA. After confessions were recorded, execution almost always followed. Families were not spared. Pol Pot viewed family ties as an obstacle to loyalty. Children were separated from parents and encouraged to report any suspicious behavior. Marriage became a collective decision made by the Angkar, often forcing strangers into unions to increase population for labor. Individual emotion no longer mattered. Personal identity meant nothing compared to collective goals. Starvation spread as food production faltered. The leadership ignored all warnings. They believed that pure conviction could overcome natural limits. When crops failed, they accused peasants of sabotage rather than acknowledging flawed planning. The result was nationwide hunger. People resorted to eating insects, tree bark, and anything they could find. Yet the regime continued exporting rice for political prestige. Disease took hold as working conditions worsened. There were no medicines, and hospitals no longer functioned. People died in fields, on roads, in makeshift labor camps. Death became so common that burial rituals disappeared. Bodies were left in shallow pits or unmarked graves. The land itself became a map of silent tragedy. Through it all, propaganda maintained the illusion that the revolution was succeeding. Loudspeakers broadcast messages praising the achievements of democratic Kampuchea. The Angkar celebrated new irrigation projects that rarely worked. They announced increased harvests that did not exist. They boasted of military strength while the army struggled for supplies. Truth was rewritten to serve ideology. Internationally, Cambodia remained isolated. Some allies, like China, supported the Khmer Rouge for geopolitical reasons, viewing them as a counterbalance to Vietnam. But most nations had little understanding of what was happening inside the closed borders. Foreign journalists were banned. Diplomacy became theater. A hidden genocide continued with almost no outside witness, yet beneath the surface, the regime was weakening. Mistrust grew among leaders. Purges spread into the Khmer Rouge itself. High-ranking officials were arrested, accused of treason, and executed. The revolution began consuming its own creators. What started as an ideological crusade devolved into a desperate struggle for control. By late 1977, conflict with Vietnam escalated. Border clashes revealed the instability of democratic Kampuchea. Pol Pot believed Vietnam intended to destroy the Khmer Rouge and take over Cambodia. Instead of seeking peace, he chose aggression, convinced that fighting would strengthen the revolution. His gamble would ultimately lead to the collapse of his rule. But in the early years, the Khmer Rouge still tightly gripped power. Ordinary Cambodians endured daily terror, forced into lives where obedience meant survival and hope became a distant memory. A nation that once valued harmony and faith was reshaped into a landscape of fear and silence. This is the legacy of the Khmer Rouge's radical experiment, a vision of perfection that demanded total destruction of anything considered flawed. A quest for absolute purity that erased millions of human lives. Part 1 of this story reveals how the revolution began. The next chapter will expose how it unraveled, how resistance emerged, and how the truth of this genocide finally reached the world. The story of the Khmer Rouge continued to unfold under the same shadow that had darkened Cambodia from the start. Fear. Democratic Kampuchea, created by Pol Pot and the Angkar, survived on intimidation and isolation. Yet, even within its fortified silence, tension grew. The regime believed that vigilance could save the revolution from collapse. The more it feared enemies, the more violence it unleashed. Purges expanded, suspicion spread. The promise of a purified society turned into a cycle of destruction that threatened to consume the entire country. Inside the leadership, paranoia took root. Pol Pot had consolidated near-absolute authority. He rarely appeared in public and kept his identity unknown to most citizens, but his directives controlled every aspect of life. The Angkar became a faceless, omnipresent power. Its orders required no justification. Questioning them meant betrayal. As the years passed, the leadership turned against its own members. Trusted commanders were suddenly accused of treason. Entire regional units disappeared. Loyalty alone could not guarantee safety. The revolution demanded constant sacrifice, even of its most dedicated followers. The espionage trials, held at the S-21 Security Center, revealed the intensity of this internal terror. S-21, also known as Tuol Sleng, had once been a school. Now it served as the largest interrogation facility in the country. Prisoners, many of them Khmer Rouge cadres, suspected of secret disloyalty, were forced to confess to crimes that did not exist. Interrogators recorded every word. The confessions formed a chain of false accusations, linking one prisoner to another, expanding the circle of supposed conspirators. Once a confession was complete, execution followed. No one left S-21 alive except the handful kept alive as technicians. The walls of the prison filled with mugshots of men, women, and children. Each portrait captured a life moments before it vanished. While political executions intensified, the civilian population struggled to survive daily life. The Angkar demanded constant labor. The construction of dams, canals, and new rice fields required massive human effort. Workers lifted soil by hand, transported it in baskets, and shaped the land without proper tools. Many of the irrigation projects were designed by leaders lacking agricultural knowledge. The canals were dug at the wrong angles, preventing water flow. Fields flooded or dried out. Harvests failed, yet the Ankar continued announcing unrealistic quotas. To the leadership, suffering became proof of revolutionary commitment. Hunger was treated as a test of will. Food distribution remained controlled by cadres who prioritized loyalty over need. New people often received less than base people. Small mistakes could result in food ration cuts, transforming starvation into punishment. Parents watched their children weaken without any power to help them. Many died quietly at night, too exhausted to cry. Disease spread rapidly in cooperatives. With hospitals destroyed or converted, there were no medical supplies, and few trained professionals left alive or allowed to practice. Traditional healers worked with whatever they could find, but many illnesses remained untreated. Malaria, dysentery, and bacterial infections flourished in labor camps. Standing water became breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Overcrowded bunkhouses allowed infection to spread from person to person without resistance. Religion had once provided comfort to Cambodian society. Buddhist temples served as community centers. Monks offered guidance and education. The Khmer Rouge viewed religion as a threat, a challenge to ideological loyalty. Monks were forced to abandon their robes. Many were sent to the fields. Others were executed outright. Sacred statues were smashed. Pagodas became storage sites or prisons. Spiritual identity, once at the heart of Cambodian culture, was stripped away. The family unit also faced destruction. Children were separated from their parents and placed into youth groups led by young cadres trained to obey the Ankar without question. The regime believed children could be molded into pure revolutionaries, untainted by past teachings. They were taught to distrust adults, including their own parents. Speaking of family love could be interpreted as counter-revolutionary sentiment. Children learned that loyalty flowed only upward to the Ankar. The smallest suspicion could lead them to report those closest to them. Betrayal became routine. Marriage transformed into a matter of state control. The Ankar arranged group weddings, choosing partners without personal consent. Couples were expected to produce children for the revolution. Intimate life turned into duty. Emotion played no role. Privacy disappeared. Even personal conversations could bring punishment. As the regime attempted to reshape society, its external conflicts escalated. Relations with Vietnam collapsed. The Khmer Rouge leadership believed Vietnam wanted to annex Cambodia. Border tension turned to open warfare. Cambodian villages near the frontier became battlegrounds. Vietnamese civilians were killed in raids that aimed to show strength but instead exposed weakness. Vietnam's military was far more capable. Every confrontation drained democratic Kampuchea of resources it could not afford to lose. Pol Pot's decision to attack a stronger neighbor revealed the widening gap between ideology and reality. Instead of securing Cambodia's future, the war accelerated its collapse. Vietnamese forces pushed deeper into Cambodian territory. The Khmer Rouge army suffered losses. Leaders blamed failures on internal betrayal rather than strategic miscalculation. Purges intensified yet again. The civilian population paid the price. As more men were sent to the front lines, women, children, and the elderly took on even heavier labor. Food shortages grew severe. Starving communities attempted to forage for survival. Any attempt to take food outside official distribution channels could result in accusations of theft and execution. Survival required silence, endurance, and luck. Most people had little of any. Despite the suffering, resistance emerged. Small uprisings took place in rural zones. Villagers attempted to escape into forests or across borders. Those caught were executed as enemies of the revolution. But attempts continued. The desire for life outlasted fear. In whispered conversations, people shared stories of the days before the revolution, when families farmed their own land and temples stood open. Memory itself became an act of defiance. By 1978, international isolation began to crack. Reports reached the outside world, describing mass graves, forced labor, and starvation. Survivors who escaped to Vietnam told their stories. The scale of violence became harder to ignore. The Khmer Rouge leadership reacted with aggression. Pol Pot ordered larger attacks on Vietnam, hoping decisive action would secure Cambodia's sovereignty. Instead, it triggered the regime's downfall. In December 1978, Vietnam launched a full invasion. Their army moved quickly. Exhausted Cambodian forces were unable to mount strong resistance. As Vietnamese tanks advanced toward Phnom Penh, citizens felt a strange mix of fear and hope. After years of silence, the arrival of a new army offered the possibility of change. On January 7, 1979, Vietnamese forces captured the capital. Pol Pot and the remaining leadership fled into the jungle near the Thai border. Democratic Kampuchea fell. For most Cambodians, liberation did not mean immediate recovery. The nation lay in ruins. Cities had been emptied, infrastructure collapsed, farmland failed, millions were displaced, families were shattered. Survivors searched for missing relatives, hoping to find familiar faces in the chaos. Many discovered only graves. The full scale of the genocide became visible as mass burial sites were uncovered. Bones and clothing rose from the soil, silent witnesses to the crimes committed by the regime. The number of deaths, estimated at over 1.7 million, represented nearly a quarter of the population. Entire professions had disappeared. Intellectuals, doctors, teachers, artists, and monks were gone. The wounds cut into every community. Cambodia faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding not only its buildings and institutions, but its sense of identity. The new government, backed by Vietnam, began documenting evidence of atrocities. S-21 was turned into a museum to preserve the truth of what happened. Survivors shared their experiences, though the trauma made it difficult to speak. Justice proved complicated. Pol Pot and the top Khmer Rouge leaders retreated to remote regions, maintaining a guerrilla presence for years. International politics during the Cold War slowed the process of accountability. It took decades before major trials were held. Even after the regime's collapse, its impact endured. Families struggled with grief and guilt. Many people faced memories of decisions made under extreme pressure, including actions taken to survive. Trust became fragile. The loss of religious and cultural practices left deep spiritual fractures. A generation that had grown up without education struggled to rebuild society. The future required learning how to live again. Slowly, Cambodia began to heal. Buddhism returned, schools reopened, markets revived, children laughed again in places where silence once ruled. The memory of trauma remained, but it did not extinguish resilience. The people who lived through the Khmer Rouge had endured more suffering than most of the world could imagine, yet they chose to rebuild. The story of the Khmer Rouge stands as a stark warning about the danger of absolute ideology. Pol Pot wanted to create a society that was pure, equal, and self-sufficient. To achieve that goal, he believed that everything old must be destroyed. The idea promised a better future, but it demanded the sacrifice of everything human. The revolution became a machine fueled by death. Cambodia's tragedy shows what happens when a society allows fear to replace compassion and when leaders pursue perfection without regard for life. It shows how swiftly power can twist ideals into cruelty. It shows that violence multiplied by ideology can consume a nation. Today, the memory of the Khmer Rouge remains a vital part of Cambodia's identity. It is preserved in testimonies, historical studies, and memorials like the Killing Fields. The purpose is not to dwell on suffering, but to understand its causes. The lessons are clear. Blind obedience destroys freedom. Dehumanization leads to genocide. No dream of progress justifies the annihilation of people. The survivors of democratic Kampuchea remind the world that the human spirit can endure even in the darkest times. Their resilience is a testament to what was lost and what remains. Cambodia continues to rebuild, honoring its past while moving forward. The dark history of the Khmer Rouge is not merely a tale of destruction. It is a reminder of the responsibility every society holds to protect human dignity, to question authority, and to preserve compassion even when fear encourages silence. When that responsibility is forgotten, a peaceful nation can become a landscape of terror in the span of a few years. The story ends not with victory or celebration, but with reflection. The scars left by the Khmer Rouge run deep, yet they also illuminate the courage of those who survived. Their lives stand as a quiet defiance against the ideology that tried to erase them. In their survival, Cambodia reclaimed its future. This is the legacy of the Khmer Rouge era, a warning written in the memories of millions and in the graves of those who never saw the world rebuilt.